On a quiet afternoon, Leonard Whitaker, a 74-year-old black veteran, sat at a small corner table in a bustling diner. His modest, well-worn jacket hugged his shoulders, and his weathered hands rested around a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. There was a calm dignity in his posture, the kind that comes from years of hard work, sacrifice, and the quiet confidence of a man who had seen and survived far more than most. He was waiting for his son, who was running late, but Leonard was never a man to mind waiting. After a lifetime of service to both his family and his country, patience was second nature. The hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware filled the air, the familiar soundscape of a neighborhood diner. But all of that changed when the door swung open and two uniformed police officers walked in. Officer Mitchell and Officer Reynolds strode confidently across the floor, their badges catching the light. They were young, full of the authority their uniforms conferred, and carrying the silent assumption that they could walk into any room and command it. Their eyes immediately landed on Leonard, the only black man in the predominantly white diner. To them, he stood out, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he simply existed in a space they believed was not meant for him. Mitchell leaned toward Reynolds, muttering something with a smirk, and the two shared a quiet laugh before making a direct line to Leonard's table. They weren't there for lunch, they were there for him. Without a greeting or even a polite introduction, Mitchell leaned over the table and asked sharply, "What are you doing here?" His tone was not curious but accusatory, as though Leonard's mere presence required justification. Leonard, calm as ever, lifted his gaze to meet the officer's eyes. "I'm waiting for my son," he answered, his voice even and respectful, though the implication of the question was clear. Reynolds snorted, shaking his head. "Unusual to see someone like you trying to fit in here," he said with a mocking smile. The words laced with condescension. Leonard didn't rise to the bait. Years of enduring racism and prejudice had taught him the power of restraint. Instead of reacting, he simply repeated that he was waiting for his son. But that calmness, that refusal to show fear or anger, only seemed to irritate the officers more. Mitchell demanded to see Leonard's ID, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Leonard reached into his pocket, retrieving his veteran's ID card, the one he always carried with pride, a small but powerful reminder of his service and sacrifices. Mitchell glanced at the card, scoffed, and flipped it back onto the table. "Probably fake," he muttered. Reynolds chimed in with a cruel smile. "Hard to believe someone like you served, when back in your day, guys like you were lucky if they were allowed to scrub floors." The words stung, not because they were new. Leonard had heard variations of them for decades, but because they represented the enduring disrespect so many black veterans faced long after they had left the battlefield. Their taunts weren't just about Leonard's presence in the diner. They were about reminding him of his place, about asserting their belief that his uniform, his service, and his dignity were irrelevant in the face of their authority. To them, Leonard was just another old black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The humiliation escalated. The officers hovered over Leonard, their hands resting on their belts, fingers brushing against their handcuffs as if daring him to give them a reason to act. Leonard's quiet dignity only agitated them further. They expected fear, submission, perhaps even anger. But Leonard gave them nothing but polite composure, refusing to validate their assumptions. The other diners noticed. Conversations quieted, forks paused mid-air, eyes flicked toward the corner table. Some patrons watched with discomfort, others with curiosity, but none spoke up. They could feel the injustice in the air, thick and undeniable, but no one was brave enough to intervene. Silence, after all, was easier. When Leonard didn't immediately comply with their vague orders to move along, Mitchell lost patience. He grabbed the edge of Leonard's chair and shoved it backward, the sudden scrape of metal on tile making the entire diner flinch. Leonard stumbled to his feet, but still he didn't retaliate. Years of military service had taught him control under pressure, even when faced with men like these, men who wore uniforms but had no understanding of the honor they were meant to represent. Reynolds, not to be outdone, snatched Leonard's veteran cap off the table, glanced at it with clear disdain, then tossed it to the floor. "You don't deserve to wear this," he sneered. For the first time, a flicker of anger crossed Leonard's face. Not for himself, but for the countless men and women who had worn the same uniform, bled for the same flag, only to return home to a country that treated them like second-class citizens. Still, Leonard held his tongue, his spine straight, his dignity intact. The final insult came when Reynolds grabbed Leonard's cane, the one that had supported his aging body through years of service-related injuries. With no hesitation, Reynolds snapped it over his knee, the crack echoing through the stunned silence of the diner. "Won't need this where you're going," he said, tossing the broken pieces aside. Leonard stood tall, cane-less, hat-less, but unbroken. The officers saw only an elderly black man they could humiliate with impunity. What they didn't know, what they were moments away from discovering, was that the man they had just degraded was not only a decorated veteran, but the father of the most powerful man in their department. And in the seconds that followed, as their own arrogance collapsed under the weight of that truth, Leonard Whitaker would show them what true strength and dignity looked like. The atmosphere in the diner had grown heavier with each passing minute. The casual cruelty of Officers Mitchell and Reynolds, once buoyed by arrogance and the assumption that no one would question them, was beginning to waver. Leonard Whitaker stood calmly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation they had heaped upon him, from the rough pat down to the unnecessary handcuffing, to the final insult of snapping his cane in two as though it were nothing more than a disposable object. But even as Leonard stood tall in silence, the tide was about to turn. On the table beside his coffee cup, lying almost unnoticed amid the chaos, was a small reservation card, a simple piece of paper, but one with the power to unravel everything Mitchell and Reynolds thought they knew. Commissioner William Whitaker, it read, the name printed in clear, bold letters. Mitchell's curiosity got the better of him, and he snatched up the card, expecting it to be something trivial. But the moment his eyes scanned the name, his face paled, his breath caught in his throat as the reality settled in. The man they had been treating like dirt, the man they had mocked, threatened, and manhandled, was the father of their boss, the police commissioner himself. The weight of their mistake hit him like a punch to the gut. Reynolds, catching the shift in Mitchell's expression, leaned over to look at the card, and his reaction was just as immediate. The color drained from his face, and his self-assured smirk disappeared. For a brief moment, neither officer spoke. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by cold, gnawing panic. They had crossed a line, not just by humiliating an innocent man, but by humiliating the father of the very man who had the power to end their careers. The authority they had flaunted so carelessly only moments before now felt flimsy and hollow. And then the door to the diner opened again. In walked Commissioner William Whitaker, tall, composed, and commanding. The room seemed to hold its breath as soon as he stepped inside. There was no mistaking him. Even those who didn't know his name recognized the unmistakable air of authority he carried. This was not just any man. This was a leader, a man who had earned his respect through fairness, strength, and an unwavering sense of justice. William's eyes scanned the room quickly, landing immediately on his father, still standing, still calm, though his clothes were rumpled, his cane broken at his feet, and the metal handcuffs still biting into his aging wrists. For a split second, William's jaw clenched, his heart aching at the sight of the man who had raised him, the man who had taught him about honor and dignity, standing there as if he were a common criminal. But William didn't let that emotion show. Instead, he turned his attention to Mitchell and Reynolds, who now stood stiff and visibly trembling. "Officers," William's voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that could cut through any room without the need for shouting. "Would either of you care to explain exactly what's happening here?" Mitchell opened his mouth, but no words came out. His confidence, once so effortless, was gone. Reynolds tried to step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Commissioner, sir, we didn't know who he was," he stammered. "If we'd known, we never—" William held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. His gaze was unflinching. "It doesn't matter who he is," William said. "What matters is how you treated him before you knew." The officers' excuses crumbled before they could even be spoken. They knew there was no justification for their behavior, no way to explain the mockery, the violence, the sheer disrespect they had shown to a man whose only crime was sitting quietly in a diner. William stepped past them, moving directly to his father. Without a word, he drew a key from his pocket and unlocked the handcuffs, his hands surprisingly gentle as they released the cold metal from Leonard's wrists. Leonard flexed his fingers briefly, but said nothing. He didn't need to. The dignity he carried, the same quiet strength that had seen him through war, segregation, and decades of prejudice, spoke louder than any words ever could. Turning back to the two officers, William's voice was quieter now, but no less powerful. "You will both report to my office first thing tomorrow morning. Until then, you are suspended, effective immediately." The finality of his words left no room for argument. Mitchell and Reynolds exchanged panicked glances, but there was nothing they could say that would erase what they had done, not just to the commissioner's father, but to a respected veteran and an innocent man. They had exposed not only their prejudice, but the rot that could spread when power went unchecked. As the officers shuffled out of the diner, the once silent patrons began to murmur, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others quietly applauding the commissioner's swift action. But Leonard, true to his nature, said nothing. He simply took his seat again, lifting his cup of coffee with the same steady hands that had carried him through so much more than this. William sat down across from his father, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. There was no need for apologies. They both knew the world they lived in, and they both knew how much further there was to go. But in that moment, there was pride. Pride in Leonard's unwavering grace, and pride in William's commitment to justice, even when it was personal. For the patrons in the diner, it was a moment they wouldn't soon forget, a reminder that character is revealed not in how you treat those above you, but in how you treat those you think are beneath you. And for the two officers, it was a lesson that would follow them far beyond their suspension, a lesson that respect, once lost, is rarely regained. As William placed a steady hand over his father's, the two men sat quietly, their bond strengthened by a lifetime of shared battles. Some fought on foreign soil, and others fought right here at home. As officers Mitchell and Reynolds left the diner under the weight of their shame and suspension, the hush that had fallen over the room gradually lifted. The conversations, once filled with idle gossip and mealtime chatter, returned, but with a different tone. There was no missing the significance of what had just unfolded. Every patron, every server, and even the cook peeking out from the kitchen understood they had witnessed something important. It wasn't just about two officers making a mistake. It was about the exposure of an attitude far too common, yet rarely confronted so directly. Leonard Whitaker, though visibly worn from the ordeal, remained a pillar of calm dignity. He had not shouted, not once raised his voice, nor demanded special treatment, even when it became clear that he had every right to. His quiet endurance, the kind forged through decades of military service and personal resilience, stood in stark contrast to the bluster and arrogance of the officers who had belittled him. Leonard's silence had been his most powerful weapon. Sitting across from him now was his son, Commissioner William Whitaker, the man whose presence had turned the tide and exposed Mitchell and Reynolds for what they were. William had grown up watching his father endure countless moments like this, some more subtle, some far worse. Those moments had shaped him, driving him to enter law enforcement not to preserve the status quo, but to change it from within. And yet, here they were again, another incident, another reminder that no matter how much progress had been made, some things had not changed at all. William's gaze drifted to the broken cane still lying near their table. That cane was more than just a walking aid. It was a symbol of the body that had grown weaker in service to a country that didn't always respect the man who served it. To see it snapped in two, discarded like trash, was almost more than William could stomach. But his father's quiet strength anchored him, just as it always had. Leonard, sensing his son's turmoil, reached across the table and rested his hand on William's. "I've been through worse," he said quietly. It wasn't reassurance, it was a reminder. A reminder that this wasn't the first battle, and it wouldn't be the last. But no matter how many times the world tried to humiliate him, Leonard Whitaker would always stand back up. The other diners, now freed from their initial paralysis, began approaching the table. Some came with apologies for not stepping in sooner, for watching in silence as Leonard was mistreated. Others simply offered quiet words of respect, shaken by the realization of how easily they had accepted the mistreatment until the truth came out. Commissioner Whitaker, always aware that moments like these held power far beyond the people directly involved, took the time to speak to the patrons and staff. "What happened here today," he said, his voice carrying through the diner, "wasn't just about my father. It was about how easily we let assumptions dictate how we treat each other." He spoke not as a commissioner, but as a son, as a black man, as someone who had spent his life walking the line between being part of the system and fighting to change it. Every word was a reminder that respect should not depend on knowing someone's name, rank, or history. It should be offered freely as a basic human right. There would be official consequences, of course. Mitchell and Reynolds would face disciplinary action, but William knew punishment alone wouldn't fix the deeper issue. Change had to come from acknowledgement and understanding, from people realizing that respect isn't earned through force. It's reflected in the way you treat everyone, whether they're wearing a badge or holding a broom. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the walls of the diner. Some saw it as another example of racial profiling, while others saw it as a much-needed lesson in humility for law enforcement. For William, it was both, and more. It was a reminder that the work was never finished, that every generation, including his own, had a responsibility to ensure that the next black veteran, the next elderly man minding his own business, never had to endure the same humiliation. And for Leonard, it was proof that even in moments of disgrace, there is dignity in refusing to bow. The cane could be broken, the insults could fly, but his spirit remained intact, a spirit he had passed on to his son, and one that would inspire everyone who heard his story. The incident at the diner was over, but its impact stretched far beyond the four walls of that small establishment. Leonard Whitaker, a 74-year-old black veteran, had endured yet another public humiliation, not because he had done anything wrong, but simply because two men in uniform decided his presence didn't belong. Yet, as always, Leonard's response was not one of anger or retaliation. His quiet dignity and refusal to stoop to their level became the most powerful statement of all. For Leonard, this was not unfamiliar territory. He had fought battles far more dangerous, both on foreign soil and in his own backyard. He had worn the uniform of the United States military, serving a country that, even after all these years, still seemed to struggle with recognizing his full humanity. Yet Leonard had never let that define him. His sense of self-worth came not from how others saw him, but from the unshakable knowledge of who he was, a man of honor, integrity, and quiet strength. This latest experience, humiliating as it was, served to highlight an essential truth. Dignity is not something others give you. It is something you carry within yourself, regardless of how the world tries to diminish it. Even in the face of blatant disrespect, Leonard never gave up control of his own sense of worth. That is a lesson the younger officers failed to understand, and one the community would not soon forget. Commissioner William Whitaker, Leonard's son, carried his own lesson away from that day. As a black man in law enforcement, William had always understood the delicate balance between serving the public and challenging the systemic biases woven into the institution he served. He had risen through the ranks believing that change could only come from within, by proving that integrity and authority could coexist. Seeing his own father treated with such casual cruelty was a bitter reminder of how far there was still to go. But William also knew that the power to change lay not just with policies and punishments, but with culture. The suspension of Officers Mitchell and Reynolds was necessary. They had to face consequences for their abuse of power. Yet punishment alone wouldn't heal the deeper wound. If real change was to take root, it had to come from a shift in mindset, from challenging the ingrained belief that respect is something conditional, only given to those who earn it through wealth, title, or status. In the days following the incident, William ordered a full review of his department's training protocols, emphasizing respect, cultural awareness, and ethical policing. Every officer, from rookies to veterans, would have to confront their own biases, not in theory, but through real conversations about race, authority, and the responsibility that comes with wearing the badge. Leonard's story became part of that training, a case study in how a simple act of prejudice can escalate into a moment that defines careers and reputations. But the lessons extended beyond the police force. The diner patrons, who had watched in uncomfortable silence as Leonard was harassed, were also left with their own reckoning. For some, there was shame in their silence, the realization that they had stood by when they could have spoken up. For others, it was a moment of awakening, a reminder that injustice doesn't always arrive with violence or headlines, but often in the quiet moments, when someone is treated as less simply for existing. Leonard himself remained characteristically humble about the attention the incident received. He had never sought to become a symbol, but he understood the power of what had happened. His dignity, unbroken despite decades of prejudice, had become a quiet beacon, a reminder that true strength isn't loud or boastful. It is steady, it endures, it chooses grace when others choose cruelty. That day at the diner became more than a personal experience. It became a story the community shared, a reminder that behind every headline, every viral video, and every public outrage, there are real people whose only request is to be treated with the basic respect every human being deserves. It was a lesson passed down not just through policy changes and disciplinary action, but through conversations at dinner tables, sermons at churches, and lessons in classrooms. For Leonard, the experience was neither the first nor the last time he would face prejudice. But as he sat with his son after the officers left, enjoying what remained of his now cold coffee, he knew that what mattered most was not how others saw him, but how he saw himself. And in that, Leonard Whitaker had never been stronger. Long after the incident at the diner ended, Leonard Whitaker's quiet strength remained, not only in the memories of those who witnessed it firsthand, but in the lasting conversations it sparked. For Leonard, that day was just another chapter in a long life spent navigating a world that too often judged him before ever knowing his name. Yet, like every other challenge he had faced, from the battlefields overseas to the struggles for basic respect at home, Leonard weathered it with the calm dignity of a man who knew exactly who he was. At 74 years old, Leonard had lived through eras of overt segregation and subtle exclusion. He had fought for a country that didn't always fight for him, served with honor alongside men who saw him as a brother in arms, only to return home to a society that refused to see him as an equal. That contradiction could have made him bitter. Instead, it had made him resilient. Leonard understood a truth that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Dignity is not something anyone can give you, nor is it something anyone can take away. It is something you choose to carry, no matter how the world tries to strip it from you. That lesson, however, was not only for Leonard. It was a lesson for his son, Commissioner William Whitaker, who had watched his father endure indignities small and large for decades. Leonard's strength wasn't in his silence, but in his refusal to become hateful or broken by the disrespect he encountered. He had taught William that true power comes not from demanding respect through fear or authority, but from earning it through integrity and unshakable self-worth. That lesson shaped William's career in law enforcement, where he rose through the ranks with the belief that justice wasn't about punishment alone, it was about fairness, accountability, and treating every person with respect, regardless of rank or background. The incident at the diner became a story that transcended father and son. It spread through the community, carried by those who had sat silently in their booths, too afraid or too indifferent to speak up at the time. But silence, in the moment, did not mean the lesson was lost. People remembered. They remembered how a black veteran, small in stature but towering in grace, stood his ground without ever raising his voice. They remembered how two officers, drunk on the shallow power of their badges, had unraveled at the first sign that their victim was more than they assumed. And they remembered how Commissioner Whitaker held them accountable, not because Leonard was his father, but because Leonard was a man who deserved respect long before his lineage became known. For the police department, the story became more than just an embarrassing incident. It became a mandatory lesson. Officers, rookies, and veterans alike were told Leonard's story as part of their training, a reminder that the measure of a good officer isn't how they treat their superiors, but how they treat the people with no power at all. Leonard's calm resistance became a symbol of why humility matters in authority and why bias, conscious or unconscious, must be confronted at every level. But the greatest impact was within Leonard's own family. His grandchildren, who had heard stories of their grandfather's military service, now saw another kind of courage, the courage to hold his head high in the face of humiliation, to remain composed while injustice raged around him, to trust that his worth was not up for debate. That legacy, passed down through quiet example rather than loud declaration, would shape how they walked through the world, knowing their worth and standing firm in it, no matter what others said. Leonard himself never sought to become a symbol. For him, that day at the diner was no different than countless other days where he had been judged prematurely. But what made it matter was the fact that this time, the world saw what dignity under pressure truly looked like. His strength didn't come from the backing of his son's title. It came from a lifetime of knowing that self-respect is the foundation upon which every other kind of respect is built. As Leonard sat on his porch in the weeks that followed, the evening breeze rustling the leaves, he thought less about the officers who had tried to diminish him and more about the quiet, steady work of living with integrity. He knew his story had sparked change, not just in one department or one town, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who heard it. And as long as people remembered that respect is not earned by power but by character, his legacy would live on. Leonard had long understood that the fight for respect is never truly over, but it's a fight worth waging, not with fists or fury, but with the unshakable grace of knowing who you are. The incident at the diner could have been just another story, a fleeting moment of injustice that ended when Leonard Whitaker walked out the door. But it didn't end there. What happened that day in a small corner of a neighborhood diner became a spark that ignited conversations far beyond those walls. It was no longer just about an elderly black veteran humiliated by two officers drunk on their own authority. It became a symbol of something much larger, a lesson about dignity, respect, and the cost of silence. Leonard's calm endurance in the face of blatant disrespect was more than personal strength. It was a reflection of the resilience of generations who had endured the same treatment and worse. His story was passed from person to person, not only because of who he was, the father of Commissioner William Whitaker, but because of how he carried himself. In a time when public outrage often explodes into shouting matches, viral videos, and protests, Leonard reminded the world that resistance can also be quiet, a refusal to surrender one's dignity, no matter how much the world tries to strip it away. For the community, Leonard's story was a stark reminder that prejudice is rarely loud at first. It often hides in assumptions, in sidelong glances, in the small ways people are made to feel unwelcome. Many of the patrons at the diner had sat frozen, watching the harassment unfold, unsure of how to respond. After the truth came out, those same patrons were forced to reckon with their silence. How many times, they wondered, had they witnessed similar moments and said nothing? How many times had they allowed their own discomfort to stop them from standing up for someone being wronged? That self-reflection spread beyond the diners to the broader town. Leonard's story became a reminder in churches, community centers, and classrooms that respect isn't something earned through titles or wealth, but something every person is owed simply by virtue of their humanity. His story reminded parents to teach their children that character is revealed not by how we treat the powerful, but by how we treat the powerless. Within the police force, the incident became a defining moment for Commissioner William Whitaker's leadership. Officers at every level were required to revisit their own biases and assumptions. Training programs were overhauled to emphasize the human side of policing, ensuring that every encounter, whether with a wealthy homeowner or a man sitting alone at a diner, was handled with the same respect and care. Leonard's story became part of every new recruit's orientation, a living example of what happens when power is abused and humanity is forgotten. But the greatest legacy was within Leonard's own family. His grandchildren, young, curious, and still forming their own understanding of the world, saw their grandfather stand firm, not with anger, but with unshakable dignity. They learned that strength doesn't always mean fighting back. Sometimes it means refusing to be diminished, even when everything around you tries to make you feel small. Leonard never asked to become a symbol, but life had a way of turning quiet moments into lasting lessons. His refusal to shrink, his ability to meet injustice with calm resolve, ensured that his story would be told long after he was gone, a story not just of personal strength, but of the power that comes when a community decides that respect belongs to everyone, always. Dignity, respect, and the quiet power of experience. As we age, we begin to see the world with clearer eyes. We've lived through decades of change, some of it promising, some of it disappointing, but through it all, we've learned that dignity and respect are not gifts handed to us by others. They are rights we are born with and values we carry within us every day. The story of Leonard Whitaker, a 74-year-old veteran who faced humiliation at the hands of men half his age, is a reminder that no matter how the world sees us, our self-respect is something no one can take away. For many seniors, this story is painfully familiar. How many of us have been ignored, overlooked, or treated as though we no longer matter simply because our hair is grayer or our steps slower? How many times have we been judged by our appearance, our age, or the assumptions others make, instead of by the lives we've lived and the contributions we've made? Leonard's story speaks for all of us who have quietly endured such moments with grace and resilience. Leonard's strength didn't come from his physical stature or any need to shout or demand attention. His strength came from the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth, who had served his country, raised a family, and lived with integrity. Even when faced with humiliation and disrespect, he never let anyone strip away his self-respect. That quiet strength is a lesson every generation needs to learn. This story also reminds us that respect shouldn't depend on knowing someone's name, title, or family connections. Leonard didn't deserve respect because his son happened to be a police commissioner. He deserved it because every human being deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of age, race, occupation, or appearance. How often do we see the world forget this simple truth? How many times do people assume someone's worth based on their clothes, their accent, or the color of their skin? For those of us who have lived long enough to experience both respect and disrespect, we know the difference it makes, not only for the person receiving it, but for the person giving it. Treating others with kindness and dignity doesn't just make the world better for them, it makes us better people too. Respect is not about how much power you have. It's about how you choose to use it. It's a reflection of your values, your upbringing, and your heart. As seniors, we hold a unique position in society. We've lived through the lessons younger generations are only just learning. We've seen how fear and prejudice can divide communities, but we've also seen how kindness and understanding can heal them. Our voices carry the weight of experience. And when we speak about respect, fairness, and dignity, people listen. So, if Leonard's story touched you, if you've ever been in his shoes or know someone who has, let's make sure this conversation continues. Like this video if you believe that dignity and respect should be given to all, no exceptions. Share your own experiences in the comments. Your story matters, and it can inspire someone else to stand tall with quiet pride. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories that celebrate resilience, wisdom, and the power of lived experience. And most importantly, share this video with your children, grandchildren, and friends, because these are the values we must pass on, not just with words, but with the way we live our lives. In the end, true dignity comes from within, but the respect we show others is a reflection of who we are. Let's make sure that legacy is one we can be proud of.